When you get in the car with your Uber driver, you don't see the other side of their life, right? You
Yeah,
don't see that they slept in
yeah.
that car. You don't see that they don't have health insurance. You don't see that they have a chronic health condition that they are not able to afford. But you see the specifically constructed experience that is for you, which is nice ride, some conversation. You get out, you rate them, you tip them, and you go your separate way. And so commentary should be trying to help people to expand their awareness of things beyond like the nice, cozy narratives that are constructed for them to experience and digest, right?
Hello humans, welcome back to Power Report. It's your host Dan from the internet, and I began this show almost a year ago in order to break past the barriers of existing political conversation. And I'm happy to say that today's episode definitely fits that bill. One of my top frustrations with news is how unflinchingly bad our media is at covering our global economy's largest and most consequential sector. Of course, I'm talking about the tech sector. The simplicity and necessity that technology has brought our modern lifestyles comes at a high cost. And that cost is a bunch of political, social, and economic problems that neither our media representatives or our elected representatives want to talk about in good faith. And of course, they don't want to even solve the problem either. So that's something that we have to deal with. But again, this is Power Report, so we're going to do things differently than everybody else. We're going to have an in-depth but approachable conversation about the role of technology in our lives and what we should probably do about it. And so I'm joined in this conversation by
Edward Ongweso Jr. I'm a tech and labor reporter at Motherboard and co-host of This Machine Kills, a podcast about tech and the political economy of it.
And as I think you'll see in the interview, I couldn't be more fortunate to be joined by someone as knowledgeable as Edward. In this podcast, we're about to disrupt your relationship to technology. But before we kick off, don't forget that my new Twitch show, Thank Dan It's Friday, is on every Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific at twitch.tv/sourcestream. That's twitch.tv/sourcestream. It's my weekly recap show of news and politics, and it helps me kind of kick things off into the weekend with my other shows, such as Power Report, like you're listening to right now, and AudioFace, of course, which you can check out at audioface.show, where me and my friend Sean review new music every single week to let you know what's the cool stuff to listen to. Again, it's a little bit of a break from politics, or is it? But you can check it out at audioface.show, so you can subscribe to it in your preferred platform, whether that's podcasts or YouTube. And all of the links I mentioned above, including the links to find more of Edward's stuff, will be found in the podcast description or video description. So without further interruptions and introductions and those kind of things, let's get into it. Edward, thank you very much for joining me on Power Report. I'm excited to have you on, least of which because there aren't many times I get to talk to fellow Black nerds, so this will be an excellent opportunity to kind of get that going. But we'll get to talking about that kind of stuff maybe a little bit later. I kind of want to get into the fact that you are constantly covering these stories about the influence of big tech and all of the ways its tendrils kind of get its way into politics. And I kind of want to express, or kind of want to explore a number of those different avenues because, the news cycle, sometimes tech stories make it in the news cycle. Sometimes you get Anderson Cooper trying to make sense of Section 230 or something. But these moments are always very fleeting. They don't actually stay or last very long in the news cycle. And so you miss a lot of really big gems about technology and the way it's influencing all of our lives, and politics and the way it has no way of handling the influence of technology and big tech companies. So that's kind of what this interview will be about, and this podcast episode will be about more broadly, is to help dig deeper into some of these topics that have been happening. And one thing I know what was really fascinating for me, especially as COVID-19 was starting, was that it looked like it was going to be this really amazing moment for labor actually in the United States. Because here you have these really big tech companies, one that comes to mind is Amazon, who has this huge delivery service monopoly in addition to operating grocery stores like 365 and Whole Foods, now Amazon Fresh. And they're positioned really well to do really well in the COVID economy. But even though they're making record profits, they're being harsher than ever to some of their workers. There was the story of Gerald Bryson, who was fired for speaking out about the working conditions at Amazon during COVID-19, how there weren't ample measures taken to clean for the workers, measures to make sure that they were socially distanced properly. And for speaking out, Amazon laid down the hammer and almost openly bragged about it. So I guess good to kind of start. Do you think that what kind of happened there or with Amazon, and I kind of know the answer, but this will help like start the picture, like, but is that indicative of just Amazon in particular, or is that something that was more widespread in tech or the way that tech was handling COVID-19?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Amazon is really, in some ways, it is unique in that it is able to get away with more. It can openly fire, for example, Chris Smalls as retaliation for speaking up against COVID. It's also structured in a way where, for example, delivery drivers are contracted through third-party vendors. And so Amazon has been able to neglect working conditions, COVID-19 guidelines, providing sanitization materials, really anything, gloves, masks, to these sort of workers because it's the responsibility of the vendor and can lash out against those who speak up. Amazon at the same time is, I think, right in line with a lot of the tech companies in that because of the stratified workforce, it's primarily focused on retaining and preserving perks and benefits and the happiness of that core employee workforce, but is more than willing and able and eager to, often we'll see like Facebook and Google and all these other companies, to throw contractors under the bus. I mean, we already have a labor system before COVID where at tech companies, contractors were given some of the worst jobs, whether it's Google with the TVCs, temps, vendors, and contractors who, and many times, or many of them might have the same job and are, given a carrot that they'll be able to transition to a full-time employee, but that's not necessarily the case, even though they outnumber full-time employees. Facebook, where they do content moderation, and are stacked in, conditions that are deplorable, that haven't improved much. Contractors are doing a lot of the invisible labor and are treated, worse for it. And COVID, I think, highlighted those problems, but also made it more urgent for these companies to prevent that from becoming a point of organizing. You saw a lot of energy spent on surveilling workers, on crushing labor actions, on preventing, union elections, as is the case with Amazon, in trying to dismiss unionizing efforts, like with the Alphabet Workers Union, in trying to quickly head off workers' revolts, like when they deplatformed Donald Trump or when they deplatformed Parler. There's a lot of attempts to, I think, be a little bit more brutal because COVID-19, as you did say, had a huge potential, to have worker revolts or strikes or work stoppages because of how bad conditions were at various points.
Yeah, it was really shocking to me that effort didn't materialize. But I think part of the reason that effort didn't materialize is that right underneath our shoulders, or like right underneath our noses, is this movement by big tech to do some of like the harshest anti-labor movements we've really seen since like the robber baron era during like the turn of the 20th century. And a lot of this isn't taught a lot in history, but we had this whole issue where you had the titans of new industry like Carnegie and Rockefeller, et cetera, who were steel magnates and oil magnates and vertically integrated all levels of their companies so that they were effective monopolies in their realms. And ultimately you had presidents come in and at differing levels either cater to these interests or decide to act in a populist way and try to destroy them. But overall you had trust laws and union laws that were kind of built from that, and that in a very going over broad history strokes kind of way helped to spur a lot of union organizing throughout at least the first half of the 20th century and a little bit of the second half before kind of neoliberalism really started kicking in. But it's also very important to highlight all that stuff about the previous era, because I see a direct relationship between the potential that there could have been to mobilize people during COVID-19 around workers' issues as they relate to tech companies, and the direct efforts those tech companies were taking to stifle any sort of dissent either among their workers or among the users of their software. I think I'm out in California, and so Proposition 22 is a textbook example of this case. But I think, would you like to kind of go into that and kind of detail that connection as well?
Yeah, I think it is correct. It's really good to both lay out the trust and labor issues, because antitrust and labor and employment laws are going to have to be thought of or more tightly and organized as strategies, working with one another, if we're going to seriously check the power of these platforms or big tech companies or companies masquerading as technology firms. During the the first year of the COVID pandemic, you're right, there was not as much labor organizing among big tech companies. But I think in the rest of society, I think it is also worth pointing out that there were a large amount of strikes and a large amount of work stoppages, or a large amount of direct actions, larger than previous years. And it had been in that sense, a good year for labor, even if they had not materialized to one-to-one victories. And that energy is carrying over where this year, with the ascension of the Biden administration, with the, we're waiting on what changes are going to happen. But, there's the NLRB, there's the FTC, there's the antitrust division. Who staffs these positions is going to be in very good position, position to realign or the balance of power here, and to do historic, large, sweeping changes. Proposition 22 is a really good example because it represents a historic transgression by, a group of companies who, the important thing to remember about the gig economy, Prop 22 is an attempt by Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Postmates, and Instacart to carve out an exemption to the California AB5 law that would have reclassified workers as employees if they were actually being misclassified by the company and failed an ABC test, which would determine, okay, do you independently control your work? Can you control the hours? Are you necessary for the company? Because if so, if you fail any of these planks of that test, then you are an employee and they're just exploiting you. And these companies were able to carve out an exemption for their work. But the misclassification is also part of a larger attempt by companies, specifically tech companies, to reintroduce piecework, right? To reintroduce fixed pay for fixed production, which was, not outright banned, but was crushed before the ascension of the New Deal legislation, right? When minimum wage was instituted and when we had a huge normalization of standards for what people would be paid inside of the economy for their work, for their labor. So this attempt to get back to piecework is a huge assault on the past, almost century of labor law, and also an attempt for these companies to realize profitability that would otherwise be illegal. If your company, as these companies do, have to change the laws radically to become profitable, that's the business model. And they're best understood as the tip of the spear, where if they do it there, they'll be able to do it in New York and in Illinois, as they're trying to, because California, is thought of as the bastion, right, of the Democratic Party, or at least one of its beating hearts of liberalism, I think, in the public imagination. You have the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi's from there. You have the governor of Newsom's, one of the more powerful governors in the country, more prominent ones. You have
has political aspirations for the presidency as well, that Californians
Yes.
have been able to telegraph since literally 2014.
Right. And it's also part of a really long-standing political dynasty, a trio of political families that have traded seats for the governorship with each other. And in key positions in San Francisco and the Bay Area for, almost 100 years as well.
Which makes it super convenient that big tech is also located right around there. So it just like makes these transactions simple.
Like with Newsom, Newsom and Pelosi are related by marriage. And Newsom and Pelosi both have very deep ties to Silicon Valley donors and patrons, at the same time also with labor. And there's been a balancing act in it, an attempt to do it. I think like the San Francisco section of the political party, of the Democratic Party, especially with Kamala Harris, also comes from this sort of political machine. That political party is concerned, or that section of the political party, that wing of the political party is concerned with balancing its relationship with big tech and with labor. But these compromises are going to undermine the labor regime and also the antitrust regime, right? Which was already compromised since the mid 20th century by this belief that instead of focusing on the actual outcomes and the concentration of market power from these companies, you should look at prices, and that the prices should be the consumer welfare standard should be the sole metric by which you judge whether a company has too much power. All these shifts are coming to home. These chickens are coming home to roost, and it is concerning that so many of the moderate San Francisco, California Dems are in positions of power in the party. But at the same time, with a labor movement that at least is on the move, and with the resurgence of this, Brandeisian antitrust movement, there's hope that they can apply pressure to Biden and his administration to get them to, be better than Obama would have been on this issue, and try to aspire to have the courage of the moment and crush these huge transgressions by these companies.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't even know about the relationship between Gavin Newsom and Nancy Pelosi. To me, that is saddening, but not surprising. And it's not saddening just because of the relationship itself, but it's indicative of how politics is sold in the United States as something that is democratic and anyone could, just happen to be a working class kid somewhere and one day make it into government. But you realize none of these kids are really working class, or many of them aren't, or the ones who at least started working class definitely get into the Congress and the halls of Senate, and that changes them. But I think that almost segues into another thing that you were talking about that was really interesting, was that California is seen as one of the bastions of liberalism. And because of that, the tech world is also seen as reflective of that liberalism. And of course, to some extent, there is. I've lived in San Francisco. I've definitely experienced that they're hand in hand. And I'm sure that also doesn't matter that another aspect of that is Oakland, just across the bay, and the radical history that exists there definitely aligns with Silicon Valley. There's a lot of stuff to be said there. But I often think that tying big tech to liberals or the left is often used as a lazy rhetorical strategy, often by folks like Tucker Carlson and conservatives who are trying to say, trying to make a censorship point or trying to make some other kind of argument, when the nuances of the relationship between big tech and the broader left of center wing of this country, those differences couldn't be more stark, especially when it comes to tech and labor. Prop 22 won in a state where Democrats won overwhelmingly, in an election where Democrats won overwhelmingly just this past November. I believe 54, 56% of the vote. And part of that was because these same tech companies who have been bombarding Californians with advertisements for their products made advertisements in those exact same styles, but about trying to convince you that, oh, this deal that's obviously very helpful for workers is actually bad for them and restricts their freedom and their ability to do things. And it's going to raise prices. And it went all the way from just rhetoric and advertisements to, if you opened Uber or Lyft around election time, you as a driver or a user had to swipe a little notification basically saying that, yes, you'll vote the right way that Uber and Lyft and all the tech companies want you to on Prop 22. And it was amazingly effective marketing using the same types of, psychology that they use to develop their apps. And to me, that was one of the scariest things, was how quickly that the so-called left state could be blinded into just straight liberalism through the same sort of colorful, poppy advertisements that have been working on them to sell them tech products. And of course, I'm not surprised, but it was definitely a scary moment, at least for me, when I'm thinking about left organizing in the future.
Yeah, I think one of the more salient moments was when the head of the California NAACP was revealed to have been taking payments directly from the Yes on Prop 22 committee, which was formed by Uber, Lyft, and these other companies, to basically endorse it and campaign in support of it and say that, yes, this would help, Black workers. This would be a great thing for them to have this guarantee that exempts the companies from Prop 22. And it was also found that she was doing this for a host of other propositions. I think that it is important to think about why it is that, on so many fronts with Prop 22, these companies were able to seduce actors that should have been against them to either be quiet or to be interested in a compromise or to support it. They had tried to do backdoor negotiations with, unions, with the SEIU, with the Teamsters, to try and push onto them the idea of a third category where you would not be quite an employee, you would not get quite an independent contractor classification, but it would save Uber, Lyft, and all of them on the long run labor costs because maybe they don't get a minimum wage, but they get the right to collectively bargain. Maybe they don't get healthcare benefits, but they get workers' comp. Maybe they don't get unemployment insurance, but they get sick pay leave or contribution to healthcare. These are all hugely concerning things because, as you said, California is thought of this as this bastion, and as I was saying, as a bastion of liberalism. But with I think San Francisco is a really good example because when you look at the history of San Francisco, a city which really birthed out of the money that flowed as a result of mining and the gold rush, and how you can see parallels between the concentration of wealth, the development of technology for private profiteering, and then ancillarily to build up, outlets for that wealth, outlets for residential housing or for speculative property so that the assets could grow and they could get a return on it, similar to, I guess, the way that money would be parked by VCs or by wealthy tech workers or executives in startups and other enterprises that are ultimately speculative but are supposed to realize some outsized return, to the grand artifice of, this enterprise destroying the ecology, right? Destroying the ecology of California and having it and requiring it eventually to just be maintained artificially, either through destroying waterways, by destroying, farmlands, by destroying, natural features that got in the way of mining loads. And I think similarly, the way that the tech industry has, destroyed, so much or poisoned and made toxic so much of like our general communities and discourse and social realities with one another, but also the political system and the economic system, right? We have an economy that is largely dependent on the growth of the tech sector, even though a large chunk of the tech sector is unprofitable and has no way to ever be profitable because it exists as a vehicle for capital to get sunk into and then pulled out at a higher return, right? Than parking your money in treasury bonds, for example, or parking your money in
Right.
some other traditional investment vehicle. This is a very, very dangerous situation. I think similarly to how it was when mining was the main driver of growth in San Francisco, right? Where the way that most of the resources were extracted, mines are horrible, hellish landscapes that evoke the imagery of like Tartarus.
Expensive.
Expensive. They were usually, historically, they were where you would send people who were prisoners of war or, for huge crimes or serious crimes in a country or some city. And they ended up resulting in stupendous wealth and were lifelines for these, lifelines for the enterprise as it was growing. And I think similarly, the basis of the tech economy now, Silicon Valley's tech economy has at one point, it was literally poisoning people, in East Palo Alto when they had that industrial plant there and they were making semiconductors and they were making technical implements there. And it became eventually a Superfund site. But they're also just literally harvesting the people who are contractors. They're harvesting the residents as they gentrify and push them out of their own locales. Like they're harvesting individuals in one way or another. I mean, not to use the sort of I guess surveillance capitalist logic or language of like, they're harvesting us for information, but they are using people in a way to build enough information to develop these ad tech products so that they can reap billions in revenue, and also so they can develop products to hand over or sell to other businesses or government contracts, or to elicit government contracts with the Defense Department, with the GSA. To zoom out and to look at the big tech and the way that it's risen is to see that it is waging a war on labor so that it can extract more profits for those that are unprofitable, that it is waging a war on, I think, the general public in general, so that it would be able to get enough funds and information to make more profitable goods for governments and other businesses, and also waging a war on the society in the political system and trying to ensure laws that protect it from ever being challenged by labor, by regulators, by other businesses. I think these are just like out of control forces. Prop 22 being a very important example that will go nationwide, but also this is what they're doing all across the country in any industry that they can possibly do so.
There's so many historical parallels, and those historical parallels are literally in the same areas of land in which these conversations are currently being had right now. And so I think it's just really amazing. I love the kind of contextualization. I want to break that down for the audience of tech companies as financial instruments or financial vehicles. Because, I mean, like, not to totally lose our audience, but like the financial sector, a lot of people also noticed that the stocks market, other than that initial crash during the start of the lockdowns, just continued to go up and up and up and up over the past year or so almost since these lockdowns started. And so it's very clear that the stock market and the financial markets are out of tune with the record numbers of job losses and foreclosures and all of those business shutterings, all of those different things happening. But it's happening because money isn't going into those kinds of quote unquote investments into people's lives so they can continue contributing to the economy. Money's going towards these derivatives, these stocks, these bonds, these ETFs, these other tools that just kind of sit there in computer space, adding value because of other like calculations, essentially. It's not really like a material thing. And so when you contextualize a tech company as an asset, a lot of these tech companies are not profitable, but these tech companies are vehicles that investors can park their money in. Maybe they'll be worth more later as these workers are worked to build some sort of thing of value. So then that investor can sell that company of value to make more money and move on to the next thing and worry less about what that company is doing to society, which I think brings us to like the next question to round things out here is that, do you get a feeling based on talking to people throughout tech on different levels in the sector that the people who are calling the shots, maybe the CEOs of these companies, the upper management of these companies, do they really care about labor in the long term, or are they taking almost this Machiavellian sort of almost Andrew Yang campaign idea that, look, we're going to automate the shit out of you anyways. Labor is going to be irrelevant in X number of years. So we just have to like hammer through this and try to not lose as much profit as we can until we don't need people to at the check stands at our stores, because the Amazon Fresh stores allow you to walk in, grab your items, and go, and you're already charged, eliminating the need for that extra job. So are they just buying time, or do you feel like they actually care about this political pressure?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's always an interesting thing to consider with one company or another if they really believe the snake oil that they're selling. Did Uber believe for 10 years that next year it would make an automated car? Did it really believe that there would be robo-taxis and flying cars within 2 years, each year that it said it was 2 years away? And similarly, do these firms believe that they're going to get rid of their workers? Do they believe that they're at a war with labor, or do they see it as just like a consequence of their larger vision? I think some executives definitely have a vision. They have like a vision of a political economy they want. They have a vision of the role that the law is supposed to play in regulations and the government and workers. And they're trying to achieve it. I think Peter Thiel would be a good example. Peter Thiel is, has ideas about what type of society and what type of businesses should thrive in that society that are, widely out of step with anybody else. This is a guy who's, I think the most generous label would be a libertarian. Um, but he, believes liberalism was a mistake. And not just like liberalism as in the Democratic Party. I mean, like, he's skeptical of, liberal thought since the Enlightenment, isn't convinced that universal suffrage is a good idea, is someone who thinks that competition is anti-capitalist and that monopolies are good. The sort of visions that emerge out of that have very specific ideas about, okay, if monopolies are good, and the government is in of itself a barrier, or is a barrier to ending competition, or should only be used to end competition, then, maybe labor is also an impediment to ending competition. And also maybe labor should be thought of as just like, something that is a short-term implement. And when it gets in the way, you excise it. And when it doesn't, you use it. Crush unions, crush collective organizing, crush any, increase in the labor costs, but use the workers as an input for production largely. And then there are others whose visions are less concerned maybe with it. I think another example is like Eric Schmidt and his attempts to foster sort of like tech nationalist, society where there's a close tie between the Pentagon and Silicon Valley. And, one of the narratives ends up being like, we're doing it to fight against China, or we're doing it to fight against Russia. We're using it to fight against our enemies and preserve our national security, because if we don't, they will. But I think, also, on the other hand, there are people like, Bezos and whoever he delegates responsibility for Amazon.com, or, the other, projects or moonshot projects that he has to automate labor, that there is a real understanding that, workers are necessary in the short term, an impediment in the long term. And you have to figure out how to balance introducing technologies that surveil them more and they may resist with the need to drive down costs, even though they're already, at bare bones level, and also reduce the threat of worker revolts. Because, I mean, the biggest threat to Amazon is still, at the end of the day, labor actions, right? That is why they hire the Pinkertons. A detective agency is, basically a labor mercenary force that, across this country's history is used to violently break up strikes and labor actions and killed laborers when they were striking. And it's now really used by Amazon to surveil them, to surveil workers in the United States, presumably. But, as my colleague Lauren Gurley did an investigative report on, they used them widely in Europe to prevent any group from connecting with the workers to organize them. I think, in a company like Amazon, there's a real understanding, okay, we can put cameras everywhere. We can put devices on the workers that they have to check in on and watch them or track their movements. And that will help us discipline them into a more reliable input in production. But we also still need to develop technology to figure out how to remove the threat, because I think at some level, workers are understood as a threat. If they unionize, if they collectively bargain, if they stop the flow of production, they are seen as a potential threat. The threat of a good example being a union or a collective group that is able to increase wages, as in, a company owned by the world's richest man. And I think also there are, automation is probably, there's a lot of automation threat or narratives or myths, right? There is an idea that automation will wipe out all of our jobs. And I think, the work by Aaron Benioff is really good in looking at automation as a consequence of larger economic forces, or the automation discourse, and saying that, it's not so much that they are going to, that these technologies are going to take away our jobs, but it's that the larger transformations in the economy make it so that there is quite literally not enough work for everybody. and that we should be trying to make sure that there is enough work for everybody, or use technologies to say if there's not enough work for everybody, let's produce enough things for everybody.
I kind of to touch on the point about how do you wrangle in these tech companies. That was a really interesting thing we just talked about. I kind of want to move into the idea of the fact that these tech companies do have an impact on their workers, but they're also running against the United States government, considering a lot of these tech companies are based in the United States. And they're also running against governments across the world, from the European Union to governments all throughout Southeastern Asia, where a lot of products, namely from Facebook, all the way down the corporate structure to Instagram to WhatsApp to everything else, probably except Oculus at this point. It's only a matter before the virtual reality headsets end up disrupting an election. But like, there have been these different avenues here where we're starting to see that it's no longer friendly MySpace Tom zone anymore. Like, we're now seeing the CEOs of these social media companies and these tech companies more broadly, because now we'll include Apple, Google, which wants to be a social media company but never ever will be because they can't make a social media app, and Twitter, etc. And they are now like doing the big boy thing. They're testifying in front of Congress right now and having to make the case that these concerns that we're bringing up and others are bringing up are not to worry, and that we should just let the robber barons keep robber baroning. So a way we really saw this contextualize was over tech and censorship, as the outgoing President Donald Trump was taken off of Twitter, and that sent kind of a cascading of effects down to where he was banned on other social media platforms in response to the fallout from the January 6th Capitol insurrection that he seemed to have been egging on. I mean, arguably since he walked down the elevator, but at least since after the escalator, but at least since after the 2020 election, when it was clear that he wasn't going to win. And he was trying to sow disbelief in that idea, saying that the true patriots have to rise up and make sure that the true vote is cast. So like, Twitter responded in that way by saying, look, we've worked around our own rules, we've created new rules, we've bent new rules for you, but now is the time / now is the PR-wise safest time to cut our hands loose of Donald Trump and censor him from the platform. And of course, this sent the right-wing, I guess, like cottage industry that cries censorship anytime someone claims to be shadow banned for not getting a lot of likes on their bullshit tweets. That sort of apparatus began to spin up, saying that this example of Donald Trump being banned from the Bird app website is an example of censorship from the tech companies. And so I guess to one part of that question, what would you say to that sort of surface level response that tech companies should or should not be allowed to censor people from their platform for certain behaviors? And then beyond that, like, where do you think the problems lie when the United States government especially tries to tackle this issue? Because I have some theories, but I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think this was an interesting example because a lot of people, it's like, oh, the world's most powerful man, like he can't use a computer anymore, like now he's just bricked out of everything. But also at the same time, like, this is a reality for a lot. This has been a reality for a lot of people. A lot of people get deplatformed. Sex workers get deplatformed enthusiastically by the at the behest of the right. Black and brown voices, dissidents, activists, people who get brigaded by right-wing hate moms get deplatformed. People who cover these beats have to, self-censor, because if they don't, they will get a backlash that could get them deplatformed, but will almost certainly result in death threats. But there's not that sort of concern or there wasn't until it was like, Donald Trump. And, with Donald Trump, it is, I think, a complex moving issue because, on the one hand, sure, you do not want tech companies to have the ability to unilaterally decide the terms in which you're allowed to use the platform or not, because of how integral the platform becomes for certain avenues of life, for media, for politics. for communication, for people, creating entertainment or creating, information or generating cultural, products. This is stuff that is, a lot of people's, bread, and how they make their living. And at the same time, there has to be a question of like, what is allowed on the platform? How are we going to moderate it? And I think that there's been a lot of good work done by, I think Becca Lewis is a really good, scholar and researcher on trying to deal with right-wing networks on these platforms, and how much of it is the result of the platform and how much of it is just the fact of a right-wing network in our society. And it's complicated because a lot of the solutions, or a lot of the things that are being proposed as solutions, we're not sure if it would work or would undermine the whole effort or the enterprise. And it's also the fact that we still have the inconsistent response, right? Where we still let these companies deplatform all types of people, because these people don't have power, or because these people are already marginalized in the larger discourse. Generally, of course, against like censorship, but I do also think there's something to be said that the push by these companies was in the face of a threat of a workers' revolt by the employees. It was Twitter employees who said, "You get rid of Donald Trump, or we will fuck with your shit."
Withhold our labor, yeah.
Which is like the thing that Twitter needs to work every day. Same with Facebook, same with AWS. And that those, these threats of a worker revolt were what led to the cascading effect. So I think in our discussions, as people are continuing to think about this, it is important to think about how the real action after 4 years came when the workers pushed it. So maybe we should look to that response as maybe the beginning of what we wanted to be for it. Maybe to hedge against companies having this unilateral power, we should democratize them more. And maybe that means the worker should control them, but the worker control does not immediately solve the question of content moderation or right-wing networks, and so on and so forth. It's at the behest of the workers. So maybe we then need to figure out new novel approaches to content moderation. Maybe we also need to address the fact that there is in this society, because of how racist it is and how racist it's been for a long time, that there's no way to really root out this problem unless we're also figuring out how to root out, the rot of white supremacy, or of just the general deluge of racist nonsense that persists everywhere, or, in large parts of the society.
I mean, really fast, like, I just want to say, just on your point about content moderation, it's in itself, what you allow on your platforms is a lot of the basic structure of like everything. Because when we were talking earlier about tech and labor, a lot of the content moderators are contractors. So they're having to see like beheadings, sexual abuse, like murder, just the worst shit. And they're not even really treated as full company employees. Like Facebook or Google contracts with these outside companies there in suburbs in like Arizona and Florida, and these people are just coming there, no mental health services, and they're just getting screwed over. And even then, when things get to their desk, the things that are chosen by them to make decisions on are created by algorithms that themselves display algorithmic bias from the people who created them. The same workers and laborers who are having to juggle with, am I okay with this like tech utopia that I've been sold that I'm currently building? Or do I want to revolt against this because I see that utopia is very clearly not a utopia? And do I want to risk my livelihood, my very comfortable livelihood in this current political economy, to go against that when there may not be very many material upsides for me in the immediate future? Everything I think comes around that aspect of content moderation and what you do around that really kind of highlights your point that the workers are not the ultimate solution to that. But they are a big solution in pushing a lot of movement within these companies, because these companies have already shown they're barely accountable to governments. Then the only way they may be accountable to anyone is by looking towards the people who literally keep the lights on, the servers running every single day, and seeing what happens. But that makes me want to get into something else I read about, which was the Google union, which is a good example. There's some news that Google started, or like workers at Google started a union. At least the last time I checked, there are almost a little under 1,000 members who'd already signed up publicly for it. And it's a really big measure to see a union starting at definitely one of the biggest tech companies in the world. But Another aspect of this that was reported in some articles and not others was that there have been attempts at a Google union for years. And these have been in response to issues with Google and labor where their company mottos tend to go against their practices. There was that case with the Timnit Gebru, who was the black AI researcher who faced all that backlash for trying to point out issues within Google's AI system and how it could be racially biased, and was reprimanded for that and ultimately like told that she was being difficult and was let go of. So I'm wondering, almost maybe this is the meta politics of it, but these unions are not existing within a bubble. In fact, even there's like union pre-politics going beyond this. So in order to, if we've established that maybe one of our best and most effective quick measures against these tech companies is for the workers at these tech companies to awaken, well, let's look at what's happening with those workers. They might be confused, in addition to the complications ethically that we talked about earlier, the fact that there have been these union attempts before. There have been these very obvious cases of people speaking out, being reprimanded, and they're unfair, but how do you reconcile these things? And to kind of tie it all to this question, what do you think this union might learn from the previous union sort of experiences at Google, and then what can be applied to other tech companies?
Yeah, the work that these groups and their partners are doing is very important in that, organizing and trying to radicalize or raise consciousness of workers so that they're more amicable to being militant and to head off these ethical dilemmas. But also there is, I think, a core problem in that, me personally, I'm not convinced that a company like Google or Alphabet should exist. Definitely not in its gargantuan form today, but also not sure if it should exist as a private company. But I think most of the conversations, we can't realistically have that conversation that the company would never listen to it. The regulatory apparatus is not, there yet. Most of the political system and the general culture views these companies as necessary and integral, and it's just that they've acted up a bit. But there is something to be said about, how much can you, reform like a broken system. I think in the wake of Timnit's firing, there was this really powerful essay I read, and it was about the ethical failures of artificial intelligence, but also artificial intelligence researchers who are associated with Google. And it was talking about how, at the end of the day, a lot of the work comes down to making sure that the phrenology is peer reviewed, or it was the metaphor that they used, the idea that we have to, make sure that unethical systems are put through ethical, structures and systems of review. But at the end of the day, things like facial recognition should not exist. Things like surveillance should not exist. These large language models probably shouldn't exist, especially because they don't even help us really they don't help create systems that understand language. They just create systems that mimic language, is one of the critiques that Timnit had in her paper. There are a huge amount of questions that kind of get overlooked because of how, and it makes sense how, immediate and urgent the threat that these companies pose to everyday life is. But, to reform them is not enough. I think there are historic examples that are interesting to think about and consider, attempts at cybernetics or the planning of, technological systems to create a harmonious production or company, the Lucas Plan, Project Cybersyn. These are examples where you could think of, okay, let's say we do decide to have a Google and Apple. Let's instead have it controlled, run by, and structured by the workers and their experiences and integrated into society in a way where it does production that's socially useful, instead of let's help the government train drones so it stops killing children at weddings. Let's help, the government, figure out, whether the conversation you just had was about some national security breach. Let's figure out if you're helping leaking information to the press. Instead of doing projects like that, or potentially doing projects like that, imagine what other alternatives could emerge if these companies were engaged in socially useful production. And then one backlash, of course, might be, well, yeah, they are, or that they are by doing these large language models, that they are by doing that work. But I'm not clear on that. I think that a large amount of energy and intellect and talent and passion is spent on building ad tech, right, and preserving monopolies. um, and yeah, that's the source of their power and their influence, but maybe it is time to like really envision a totally different company. And sure, we're not there yet, but I think that is something important to look at as a source of inspiration, because other workers have done it before. Even if it just because it wasn't successful doesn't mean it shouldn't be looked at. It should be animating a lot of the discussions. And I think that the union though is really exciting in that, they're growing, and they're also ensuring to include contractors, right? Which is, I think, a good step because of how
Yeah.
the company uses that division of labor, to preserve a lot of projects, to preserve a lot of competition, or cutthroat dynamics that might otherwise prevent solidarity across class lines, and to also genuinely suppress militancy. Um, I'm excited by it. Yeah, also at the same time feeling that there also needs to be the question, like, should Google even exist? Does it deserve to exist?
Yeah, does it deserve
And
to be
I
as
can,
big as it is? I don't really think so or agree, even though I'm like, you really pick one of your tech titans at this point. It's like either Apple or Google or Microsoft or a combination of them. And my combination is Microsoft and Google, and many of their products do help my life, but they would also help my life, and those same smart people would be there if it wasn't all this one big misconnected thing that had too much power on its own, constantly avoided taxes, and couldn't make a social networking app properly. But like again, the elephant in the room here remains our elected officials and our politicians, and the fact that they have, it's literally their job to look at antitrust cases, look at things like these. And we had, it seems almost like at the beginning of the internet, you had like the Telecommunications Decency Act, the Communications Decency Act, all these different things that were established in a way where, okay, we know the internet's here, we don't know what it's gonna be, but here are just like the ground rules. And since then, it seems like there's just been this sort of hands-off, laissez-faire approach, thinking that, well, the way the internet is the way the internet should be and continue to, until we get to net neutrality and whether or not companies can prioritize data on their networks in certain ways or not based on their interests. Of course, that's when the internet has to change. But anytime I see some of these hearings where the tech companies come up in front of Congress, I noticed three things. I noticed from the Republican side that the questions are less about what the hearing is meant to be about, and it's more about, I posted this thing on Facebook and it only got this many likes when I posted this thing on Facebook and it got this many likes. Why do you hate America? And it's just like, or like, how come I can't search this thing in my Gmail, was literally one congressperson, like one lawmaker's question about. Like, these just like absolute.
why did no one like my shit post? That's like a lot of their questions too.
Yeah, it's just absolute, like, never mind, it's like the kind of stuff that your boomer parents or grandparents would be texting you about, asking these like basic questions about how to use their phone. It's almost purposely bad faith and wasting their time, because if they start talking about business regulation, that's just not a friendly course for Republicans to be on anyways. And that's part one. Part two is what I noticed from Democrats, which is just like, you get some glimpses of hope there. You have some Congress people who are generally on the ball. I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is really good with this. I think Ro Khanna, 60 to 75% of the time, is good with this and his understanding of big tech, but is still too close to it for me for a little bit of my desires. But most of the Democratic Congress people are just woefully unprepared and don't really know exactly what they're talking about. So much so that, like, me, like a passively knowledgeable person about politics and tech, can just go, well, that's just entirely a misunderstanding of Section 230 right there. There's all these other different things that they just seem woefully unprepared to do the job of making at least the case that there should be something being done. Because we already know what the Republicans are going to do. They're going to complain about censorship, ask why their sister can't see their post, and ignore the business repercussions of it. Democrats are supposed to be there to address the business repercussions and the political ramifications and societal ramifications of big tech. But many of them are beholden to those business interests, as we said, of that relationship between the coastal elites in the Democratic Party and the big tech elites around there. But Like that's the second thing I noticed is that the Democrats more or less aren't really strong enough from where they should go. But the third thing is altogether is that you take those two things, and it seems like our lawmakers both aren't prepared to deal with these tech issues and don't want to. And so, of course, the obvious position is like the same thing you do with everything, every political issue, when you realize that the people in power either don't want to deal with that issue or are woefully unprepared with that issue, and you like primary them and get them the hell out of office. But beyond that, I think there needs to be almost a recontextualization or a resetting of how we should approach big tech. I like that historical analysis that we did earlier in the podcast of like there are a number of historical precedents and examples for locally what's happening in San Francisco and what's happening to people who live around there, and globally, or sorry, even nationally, and what's happening with Facebook and Google and Amazon and our local, our national political elections, but even globally, where you have misinformation being spread through WhatsApp groups in parts of Southeast Asia and parts of South America. You have tweets that are running afoul of major leaders here and there who want them to be censored. And so there are these fights that are there. It's gone way out of control. By the way, none of these companies pay taxes. So it's like they're almost doing free hearings with the Congress. But like, this is such a mess. It's so out of control. We spent nearly an hour talking about how much out of control this is, but it ends up at the fact that every given opportunity, it seems like these politicians don't want to do anything about it. And we're starting to see some things, because we saw antitrust actions against Facebook and now Google lately as a result of those hearings I'm talking about. But do you think there is something missing from this calculation that politicians need to better utilize so we can see some more tangible actions in the future? Or maybe this is just a slow process?
I think part of the problem here is just like how generally corrupt the American political system is. I mean, like, to a great deal, I think a great example is the telecom monopolies. I mean, telecom monopolies literally write the laws, right? They're fused to the state intelligence apparatus. They lobby so effectively that regulators have no interest, it seems, in regulating them or seriously holding them accountable for anything that they do, or and handing out tax breaks whenever they can that amount to tens of billions of dollars, giving them subsidies and grants for programs that they never finish, like providing fiber optics or broadband coverage to rural areas or expanding it in cities. There's all sorts of ways in which there's a massive amount of grift, a massive amount of donations for access, a lot of back and forth, and close relationships and transactional relationships between companies, PACs, and politicians. That, on some level, there's a reluctance to see it as a systemic issue and more as like you just need the right people in place. I think a lot of people over time, because we have a system that inculcates these close relationships between, like, a lobbying team whose only job is to live in DC and schmooze every politician that they possibly can. And that's the relationship that they have with this company, while millions of people across the country have a wildly different relationship with them. It's part of the problem. But also at the same time, it is that because of how over the past, century, I would say, of labor attitudes changing, and also over the past half century with antitrust thought and attitudes changing, that there has been a real shift, which has led us to the point where people, regulators, scholars, may not see a real problem, a systemic problem, and just see it as incidental, or as a moment, a strange moment, but that normally the system works and the course needs to be corrected. I'm encouraged by the surge of movements, activism, revisionist histories, critical looks and engagements that have revealed that to not be the case, and that there is really a serious threat here to the balance of power between labor and capital. It's already so far, shifted to capital, but there's a threat to the chance of ever, engaging in a compromise again and having workers get some livable, set of benefits out of letting capital control every other part of the society. And to get there needs to be more pressure applied. There needs to be, of course, like some, stubborn politicians removed, there needs to be, I think like part of his personnel's policy, there just need to be more people placed in more of these positions, who are willing to listen to or negotiate with or take notes and cues from the movements, that are organizing and applying pressure. Because otherwise, I mean, you can have organized movements, you can have a labor movement, you can have an antitrust movement, but if a Google lawyer runs the antitrust division, they don't give a fuck. They could care less. They could care less. And if Google lawyers are running like every part of the apparatus, or if Verizon lawyers are running every part of the apparatus, like Bill Barr was, Verizon lawyer, and he was running the DOJ, they don't care. And
Or
they're
like
not going to be threatened.
Ajit Pai was a lobbyist for Verizon too, right? Before he was chairman of the FCC.
I mean, yeah, there needs to be people who are going to listen, who are willing to understand, or who will be scared, in all honesty. And corporate lobbyists and lawyers are at the bottom of that list. And as are the people who consider them friends. And I think, that is also going to be, and that remains to be a huge barrier to the real change that we need to see to restructure how the labor operates and exists in this country, and also how companies are allowed to concentrate power.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said there. There needs to be like a fundamental shifting in the system itself. We need to realign and say, okay, we understand there are corrupt politicians, but these politicians would be slimy people outside of politics, but our political system rewards corruption, uses corruption as like a standard means of operating, and you have to almost create new means in order to operate outside of that and then be accountable to different groups of people, like the Justice Democrats doing small dollar donations to try to make themselves more financially accountable to regular constituents around the country, as opposed to making their time more available towards people who are lobbyists in office. Like there was this really good article that I think CNBC got a hold of, a recording from one of Microsoft's presidents, basically saying that, yeah, this is pay for play. The reason why we donate to politicians, even though there are a lot of companies, including tech companies, that are rethinking their donations to politicians in the in the aftermath of the January 6th Capitol insurrection. Even though there are a lot of companies who are rethinking their political contributions, Microsoft is very much not one of them. And yeah, that thing was recorded on tape courtesy of CNBC, where he said, we donate money here because these politicians, they have these weekend get-togethers and they only invite the people to come to those get-togethers who have donated the money. So that's the way we get in those politicians' ear, and that's the way we are able to like be heard. And it's almost said in a way, if I had the direct quote here, it's almost said in a way where like, it's almost dumb for us, you and me, Edward, that we're not giving our Congress people $2,500 so that we can get in these meetings too. I mean, like, if apparently it's just that easy. But there's a fundamental like issue with the way our political system works, where like, politicians have talked about this all the time. This isn't new with this Microsoft situation. There are outgoing Congress people who go, yo, most of my time is not legislating, it's not speaking to constituents, it's phone calls with donors and hearing what they want to say and all these different things. And he's saying yes sometimes and saying no other times. It's just inserting yourself into a greasy, corrupt system with no real way to change it on an individual level, and just trying to do what good you can before it spits you back out seems to be what a lot of Congress people say about it. So it's very indicative of the system, and it's something that these tech companies definitely know about and are actively exploiting. And I think that's the important part to know there, is that there isn't this sort of like willful ignorance or they don't know. It's that, no, these lawyers are paid a lot of money. These financial analysts and accountants are paid a lot of money. They know what they're doing. They know what they're doing, very much so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were 147 members of Congress that voted against certifying the election, right? And people are calling them the Sedition Caucus. And there's this really great report from Citizen called what is it? I think it was about the Sedition Caucus. I think it was Big Tech Bankrolls, the Sedition Caucus. A great report by Gene Chung and Mike Tanglis, and basically talks about how, look, like these big five tech companies, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, publicly and privately condemned the insurrection in one way or another, right? But also at the same time donated like $2 million to the 147 members of Congress who voted to say the Electoral College was bullshit, and that Donald Trump, might have won the election. You have, each of them, you have like Amazon, for example. Amazon donated to 89 of those members. By itself, about like 61% of them, almost $500,000. Microsoft donated 69, almost $400,000. Google donated to 61 of them, almost $500,000. These are, the real statements, I think, from these companies, and not like the belief or the PR moves by them that, oh, like we oppose the riot, we oppose the insurrection. I mean, if that was the case, then why were they also donating to campaigns run by Loeffler and Perdue, who both said that they were gonna vote to oppose the certification of the election? These companies, word, talk is cheap for them. The money, as you said, I'm pointing out with that CNBC recording, the money is the means to which they can get what they want: help with taxes and reducing them, help with visa issues, help with gutting or killing or circumventing legislation that they view as problematic. It's pay to play. And that is like the overriding structure. That is the rules. That is how the Washington operates. And until stuff like that is rooted out, it's always going to become a recurring threat. We can get all the antitrust rules and all the labor reforms that we want, but we can do that. And if it's still a corrupt political system, then that shit's going to be gone in a few years, as was the case. I mean, we had massive antitrust and labor reform before, and it was over time, over the course of a century, partly because of corruption, partly because of larger changes in the general economy that allowed specific actors to get enough power and to convince enough politicians or to change the underlying ideology and support for certain policies in their favor to undermine those reforms, right? And if we do not root out the corruption, it will happen again. But also, I think that the reason it's hard to root out the corruption is because I think it's just an endemic nature of capitalism, that these people are going to try to use the state as a vehicle for their interests, which is preserving their control over the production of something, or preserve their sovereignty or autonomy, or preserve the interest of their investors, or preserve the ability of the company to prioritize profits, or prioritize reducing labor costs, or prioritize cleaning up its own house. And within this political system, we can change it, but the larger economic system encourages it still, I think.
One of my favorite books about political economy I read was Mariana Mazzucato's Entrepreneurial State. And it's almost my to me, it's my libertarian to socialist pipeline that I give to people that I'm kind of annoyed with, who like my economics and finance major friends, who like hearing about these things in their terms. But ultimately, what she's talking about in the book is saying that, look, the government is one of the biggest venture capital investors the tech sector has ever had. When you look at the internet and the fact that that was funded through Department of Defense and DARPA, and that movement was really pushed there. A lot of these servers to create the first computers that could talk to each other are down by UCLA, the public university run by the state of California. The state, in many ways, especially up till the 90s, was instrumental in providing the labor, the human capital, and the financial capital to help innovation go on. But there seemed to be this tail at the end where, unlike most venture capitalists, where they're like, we want this amount of money when we pull out, we want this when it's done. They're just like, no, just pay taxes maybe and behave yourselves. And that's kind of the way the government works. Even my favorite example that I don't think a lot of people bring up, but I will because of my personal vendetta against the man, Elon Musk and Tesla. He had a company before that called Solar City that qualified for federal benefits because of Obama's stimulus package during the 2009 economic collapse and 2008 economic collapse. Tesla also received some money around the time Elon Musk was making the original Tesla Roadster, and through that funding and other funding, he was able to basically save Tesla from financial extinction, build that Roadster, and then go on his plan to build luxury cars that he can build non-affordable luxury electric cars and then sell those at prices that don't make sense, and even though the cars still fall apart and all that shit, right? So Elon Musk, who is even more so, like, depending on how you count the financial instruments any given day, richer than even Jeff Bezos, right, is a direct beneficiary of government capital, of United States capital. Meanwhile, the United States government, I'm not necessarily saying they should, I'm not necessarily saying they shouldn't, is not going to Elon Musk like, yo, where's our 10% cut? Like, they're not taking his shares, they're not doing anything like that. So I do very much love this book and this author, and so I try to apply a lot of these things to American problems. But do you think that maybe a influx of politicians, maybe a new caucus, a progressive caucus, could take along this view of things that, hey, the government should act more like a venture capitalist if we're going to stay in this like capitalist system, and it should continue to invest in these companies, but also think more smartly about how the public uses those as the investor acting as the taxpayer. So like maybe in this system, we would have a public social network where some of these arguments about freedom of speech are a little bit more direct because it's controlled by the government. But you also don't have to worry about censorship that private companies may choose to do for whatever logical or illogical reasons. So that's kind of my point of optimism. I wanted to know what your thoughts would be on that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. A way to think about it is not, or like I understand the idea that since the government already is the venture capitalist, it should figure out a way to lean on the companies, and so that these things are more accountable. But I think another way to think about it is like, since the government funds these things, it should just democratize them more. I mean, these are large institutions that affect every one of our daily lives, whether we want them to or not. At the very least, they should be run by the workers and not in the name of investors who are mainly concerned with profits. But in reality, they should be run by the public. And that can be in a variety of ways. That can be your local control. That can be municipal control. That can be federal control. Public control doesn't always mean Washington, D.C. controls it, but it does mean that we should control it. And I really do think, pretty much all the social media companies, pretty much a lot of these platforms that provide like on-demand services, as much of them should be cut down to size and then integrated into a localized system, where then if we decide we want them to be a larger scale, we can have them integrated into some larger system. Like, part of like with social media, the size is such a huge problem. I'm not even sure if it makes sense to have one central globalized communications platform right now at this point, right? And it doesn't mean that you can't talk to people overseas, right? But it does mean we need to think about better ways for moderating and handling this stuff with public control here before we start scaling it up further and further and further. The development model for the digital economy and for the internet has been haphazard. Just pour a bunch of sand over it on top of like other layers over and over and over and hope it doesn't collapse. And I think the foundation is rickety. The materials we're using are rickety. We need to, in all honesty, not be afraid of experimentation. And maybe experimentation means, destroying a lot of the things that we've built up over time, but also realizing that the things that we enjoy, the things that have worked for us, the things that help us are not necessarily things that are good for us, right? They're things that we have either been conditioned to accept, told that are natural outgrowths and the only possible way that something can exist, or been exposed to for so long we've never considered that there is an alternative. Maybe you can have a totally different social media platform where you speak and you don't immediately get brigaded by right-wing bigots or racists if you're Black and a vocal critic of something. That would be nice. And maybe we can see how to create a system like that isn't Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever social media platform. There are lots of alternative methods for developing them that have exist experiments that might be interesting to scale up. But we'll never know if we are wedded to the idea that these are private firms. We should let them compete with each other. We should let them be dynamic engines of growth. Because to me, it just doesn't make sense why you would want your ability to communicate with each other to be on the market. Why does it make sense for the ability for me and you to have a conversation to be something that a corporation can innovate or develop, when it should be something that we have a say in, because we're the ones that are communicating, and because they're interested in doing it in a way where they can get a cut of it, right? Or find something that will give them, their own profitable enterprise. That system has not worked for us. So why would we return to it?
That makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of these things with tech, it's always an interesting thing because we associate tech with a lot of our sci-fi fantasies, and we want it to be the manifestation of what we want good to happen in the world. But it's always way more complicated than that, and you have to come across these existing systems and new systems that you're creating that mimic existing systems in order to kind of manage your way out of this. But I think it begins a lot with the reimagining and placing of oneself in one's context to understand what can truly be possible, and then what is being sort of held down, or what is the possible that is being held down or held back by certain features, and what can be done about those features that might be outside of the box. And it's really amazing, I think, that you have this sort of ability to see these things as separate pieces, because even getting political people into the tech world can even be a big jump, right? So even how did you, as someone who even when I was thinking about oh, do I want to talk in front of a camera about politics for a living? Do I want to do that thing? I wanted to make it very focused on the intersection of politics and technology, and because that just seemed okay, well, this is the future. This is where all of business is happening, and politics is connected to it. This is just going to be an interesting beat, right? So, I guess, how did you come to that mindset as well?
Yeah, a long time ago, I wanted to, I wanted to be a doctor, and I was going to this school. I was going to Maryland for pre-med, and could not handle it and dropped out. And the dropping out was the best thing I did, because it gave me a chance to actually, work in a bunch of positions, try to spend time learning myself, learning about what I liked and was more interested in, which was politics, but what my general politics were. I got to do organizing. I got to do labor organizing. I got to do, electoral organizing. And those experiences, eventually when I went back to school, convinced me that I would either be fine with doing organizing or maybe some sort of, analyst or writing position about these two things. And it was really only in near the end of, my last year where I was doing a research project on Uber and Lyft, and getting frustrated because I was doing research on the earlier coverage of it, getting frustrated with the coverage, and also getting frustrated with and remembering the conditions I saw among drivers and not seeing it spoken about as much, that I thought that there might be a way to fuse them. But before then, my belief would I have to do one or the other, right? I think fusing them just came more out of a consequence of experiences than a plan, but ever since has felt to me like the right approach, because so much of how we talk about these things and how we think about these things is solely focused on the economic side. Not about the moral questions, not about the ethical concerns, not about the workers that are involved in them. And that's not to say that doesn't exist at all. I mean, that is a growing part. And I think that has always been a strain of labor reporting. Labor reporting has always been good about focusing on the workers, and as a result, focusing on the real human element, on focusing on the ethical concerns and the morality of systems. But tech has gotten away with that and prevented people from looking at the labor side, because the belief is, tech is this divine thing. It is this magical force that we discovered, that was waiting for us. We discovered, we've harnessed it, and now it's changing our society. When technology is just another system, another tool, and the real powerful things, the real things that are alive, are the human beings behind it, not just the workers also, but the people who are planning how it's used. And that a lot of the stuff we ascribe to technology is really the consequence of people planning on how to use it, right? And seeing the real consequences of that. Uber, for example, is hailed as this magical disruptive force, and yet a lot of the drivers I knew in my organizing sleeping in their cars, right, unable to see their children for weeks at a time. Horrible, horrible lives, driven to the brink of catastrophe and despair. That is not a choice that they made. If this technology is so good, then why are they suffering like that? Well, obviously, it's because it's a consequence of a decision that someone else made. Okay, well, if that's the case, then how can we tease that out for other people to understand? Because it's not obvious. When you get in the car with your Uber driver, you don't see the other side of their life, right? You don't see that they slept in that car. You don't see that they don't have health insurance. You don't see that they have a chronic health condition that they are not able to afford. But you see the specifically constructed experience that is for you, which is nice ride, some conversation. You get out, you rate them, you tip them, and you go your separate way. And so commentary should be trying to help people to expand their awareness of things beyond like the nice, cozy narratives that are constructed for them to experience and digest, right? And you do that by melding, political context and labor, hopefully, and I think critical, engagement. Sometimes hate, I hate a lot of these companies, but and that's definitely, my bias. My bias is towards the workers, but I think that's fair to have, when so much of it is biased towards the companies.
Amen on that. And I think a lot of this is also, like I said, we're looking towards a brighter future, right? And so because I rarely get to have this exact intersection of conversations, very rarely, I wanted to get your take on sort of the idea of Afrofuturism, which has been kind of used for at least half a century now as kind of viewing the Black experience as not only sort of in a world that is post a lot of these socio-economic and racial injustices that people in that community face, but also looks at Blackness as tied to the future and tech and allowing that technical progress to take Black people along with them as opposed to leaving them behind. And so I guess in that sort of moment, like, what are your thoughts on like Afrofuturism in general? And like, what are your, I guess, wishes and hopes for the future of Black people and their relationship to technology?
Yeah, I think one of my, some of my favorite writing, some of it not explicitly Afrofuturist and others just, it's, by Black writers, I think gives like the best sort of look or best understanding, I think, into the ways in which tech is used, right, and is a system that can oppress or liberate people. And I think it is really fascinating to think about or to use Blackness as the basis for engaging with technology, right? To try to to deconstruct the myth that technology is a divine thing, right? And also to make people more awareness of like the experience of Blackness and the ways in which it gets mediated or lived in life, whether that's through class or whether that's just through race itself or sexuality. And I think that, some of my favorite stories, like for example, with Octavia Butler, but more recently with like N.K. Jemisin's, where they're not explicitly technologically driven, right? But Blackness does form the basis of the sci-fi future to think about the ways in which specific systems or technologies or magics, right, can just emerge as tools to oppress deeply a group of people and build up the oppression as just like an everyday part of life. I think that's a really important thing and lesson to carry forward with technology, which is that it is not like some neutral vehicle of whatever the environment has. I mean, like to push, like when we push back against the idea that tech is not inherently good, that does not also mean that it is like neutral, right? That in a society, which is racist and which already views or uses, Black people, poor people, white, anyone who is not a holder of capital in very specific ways, right, exploits them, that technology ends up doing that. And in these, these futurist visions, then the idea is like, okay, what would a technology look like if you didn't have that as like a core part of the experience for a lot of people? And I think it's a breath of fresh air. Although, I mean, maybe not like the Broken Earth series. Broken Earth series is by Decade Jepson is pretty fucking depressing. But but
Yeah, there's a lot of different takes you can have on it.
yeah, but it's like there are moments in it where you can see what it, by viewing it from the perspective of a character whose blackness is censored, what it looks like to be free of a system who's constructed explicitly to exploit you, and think about that as a basis for like what a society where we decide to use these technical systems to free ourselves instead of preserve systems of power might look like. It might be a very pleasing experience. It's part of the series where like they are able to get away from the pier. Is it the pyramid? It's been a while since I read it, but the pyramid, and they live like in this island community for a short while. And I thought of that as like one of my favorite points of the book, where it's like, yeah, there's not too much of tech around, there's not too much of like the magic around, but there is just like a focus on their family, on like the connections they have with the community and the people on the island. And I think about that smallness as something that needs to be thought of, that I think Afrofuturist, visions also, latch onto, that we don't have to just have tech that is monolithic and universal, and that actually might be part of the danger. It might be a good idea to just scale back and not have it in some places entirely, and to instead just focus on ways we can get back and claw back from the nonsense that has been fed into our heads to convince us to treat people with hatred and bigotry and contempt, just for the purpose of like making a system hoard resources for a few people. So I don't know. Those are a bunch of scattered thoughts, but yeah, that's I do think that it is like some of my more favorite sci-fi, but there's not nearly enough of it. Maybe as like we start to turn more against tech, we'll see more.
Yeah, I'm very much the same. I'm getting into it more from a literature angle, but I've always just liked it as like an aesthetic, just from the basic like imagining a mix of like the Jetsons meets blaxploitation. Like there's just always like that sort of vibe. But I mean, to me, I relate it to a lot of the political things I see, where there's like, at least I see a big gap in tech adoption. Even like, I'm super fortunate. I'm speaking to you over like a half a gigabit internet connection wired here, and near my like nice middle class like neighborhood and all these things. But there are a lot of people who live in like not even like not even like rural areas that are far away from both of us, but like urban centers about 10 miles away from me that are just dead zones for internet, where, especially during COVID-19, these black and brown families have had to adjust to a world that was not built for them, that was not built for these people in mind, that was not built acknowledging the inequities of even something as access to internet, let alone what you do with that technology once it's there. And so, yeah, I think a lot of my, not just even Afrofuturism, but just what I want for the future of technology is us for to transition technology as tools again, not the things that dictate our lives, but things that make our life easier or more automated so that we can get to living life and enjoying life in a better way. And as that relates to Afrofuturism, it's to getting both internally like closer to community and family and spirituality in those ways as it makes sense as the atheist, but also in ways where it's empowering and enlightening and able to use technologies again as tools for liberation of all different kinds, liberation from colonialism in other countries, or liberation from the impact of capitalism, even in more developed countries. Not just this sort of like black capitalist, like I'm going to be the oppressor now kind of thing, but more just like we can use technology as it exists as a catalyst and as a conduit for us to be able to focus on the other things that aren't technology in itself. So that to me is like my Afrofuturist like hope and dream there. But I think it ties in with a lot of what you're saying, that ultimately the technology is great. It does everything we can imagine it to and more, but it's a Pandora's box we don't know how to deal with. So let's deal with it, but let's also, just understand like there's a limit to this. We created Twitter. It's this wonderful communications tool. All we do is basically dunk on dads who tweet their parenting styles or whatever Piers Morgan happens to say in any given day. Like that's the limit of the technology now. So we can learn to like scale it back and understand when we can do things again.
I think I think also, Broken Earth is really fascinating because it begins the series with just like a very, the cataclysmic event of destroying like the center of the continent's like, empire, right? And destroying like what is a very well advanced, harmonic set of technologies to harness magical energy and to bring prosperity to a narrow group of people and a wider, standard of living to everybody. But that the whole thing needs to be destroyed before anything, damn the cost, before anything else can spring up. And I think that idea is interesting. It's not considered as much in general when we talk about technology because of how much people benefit from a system like ours, even though it hurts so many people. Billions of people across this world live in abject poverty or in miserable conditions so that 1, maybe 2 billion people can live a relatively modest lifestyle. Those of us within it feel that, okay, the solution is to mediate and reform. But, for a lot of humanity, it would make more sense to just destroy it, right? And figure out how to rebuild from there. And I think like in a lot of these stories, the willingness to explore an urge to destroy or the rage at being crushed by a lot of these systems is something that people need to think more of and have a hard time doing because, they are not Black, right? They're not, or they're not sitting with maybe a certain, or they're not sitting with experiences that like have continually left them out of a system that is otherwise prosperous and fine for other people. I mean, and some of them have, poverty is all, enough of an experience. I grew up, pretty, poor area in like a very wealthy county and a very wealthy part of Maryland. And that was a radicalizing experience in of itself, just seeing like how, as soon as you turn the corner in very specific neighborhoods, you get into huge homes or you get into like radically different maintenance of roads or public infrastructure, of internet, of water than people who live just on the other side of something, right? And it makes no sense other than because they're not white, right? And that sort of experience, or people who experience those sorts of things, I think are more willing to say like, okay, like this thing, it's fine if we get rid of it and start over, than those who benefit from it and only want things to get a little bit less comfortable in the hopes that as many people as possible will be bought off with that marginal change.
It's always those easy solutions that get us. Everyone, or like the people who are comfortable want the easiest solution to stay comfortable when, there is that solution. It's luxury automated space communism, but every other way around that is going to have to deal with some sort of discomfort. And it's the same discomfort that oppressed individuals have been dealing with for centuries, ingrained in them, like through generations. And it's also not even that level of it, but it's just like a similar kind of distress and discomfort. But I think understanding that there aren't easy solutions to these things and then being willing to go, okay, there aren't easy solutions. That's not going to scare me. I'm going to do the work, even if it takes a little bit of time to understand these problems and the nuances between them, and then figure out a way to help connect with other people who are similarly affected and concerned about these nuances to take action. Because we had this really heady conversation about all these different topics. I know my audience is full of really smart people. We'll be getting some of this, much of this, but then the next step is, okay, where do you go from here? But even if you're not as engaged as you and I are in this directly, or even the people who are super plugged into the news about politics and technology can understand and build a bit of uneasiness with the way technology impacts our lives as a society. And that's a way you can start in, to use union terms, like agitating people and getting them to understand these larger issues and building that curiosity for themselves. Then you're just adding allies to your side and helping things out there. And I think in different points in this conversation, that's kind of been the clear thing, is that the reformation of technology and tech culture that is needed right now is going to come from the bottom up and definitely not the top down. But that all kind of really highlights that point of what you said, is that this is going to be something that we all need to kind of really get involved with and understand the implications of technology on our lives, so that we can make smarter decisions about our uses of technology and what we want our lawmakers to do on our behalf, and how closely we're watching those lawmakers on our behalf. So yes, thank you very much, Edward, for joining me. Tell folks again where they can find you and your brilliant work.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It was great talking with you. I am on Twitter, Big Black Jacobin. You can also find our podcast, Machine Kills Pod, on Twitter. And my work, you can find it at VICE Motherboard in the tech section, where I write about labor and tech.
Hell yeah. Edward, thank you very much for coming on and making my Twitter experience also generally more enjoyable. I appreciate it, and it's been great talking to you.